There's a sentence a lot of people carry quietly into every relationship they have, usually without ever saying it out loud. You're too much, too sensitive, too needy, too intense, too emotional, too much to handle. Someone said it once, maybe more than once, maybe never in those exact words, but in 100 smaller ways. A sigh, a slow withdrawal, a look that communicated it was somehow exhausting to be loved by you. And the sentence stuck, the way certain sentences do, less like a memory and more like a verdict. Here's what we're going to look at today, and it's a reframe that tends to land hard the first time someone actually hears it. The problem was very rarely that you were too much. The problem was that they didn't have the capacity to meet you, and it was easier for them to make that your fault than their limitation. This isn't a comforting slogan. It's a specific claim about how emotional capacity actually works, why certain people experience completely ordinary needs as overwhelming, and why the person with a smaller capacity almost always ends up being the one who defines what normal looks like in a relationship, even when their normal is actually just their limit. It's worth naming why this particular phrase, "you're too much," does so much damage compared to other criticisms a person might receive. Most feedback in a relationship is specific. You forgot my birthday. You were late again. Specific feedback, even when painful, points to a behavior, something bounded, something that could theoretically be changed without touching the core of who you are. But "you're too much" isn't specific. It doesn't point to an action. It points to your entire way of being, your emotional volume, your baseline need for connection, the fundamental amount of you that exists in any given moment. There's no discrete behavior to adjust because the criticism was never really about behavior in the first place. It was about your existence being experienced as excessive, which leaves a person with nowhere to go except to try to become smaller in some vague, undefined, ultimately impossible way. Let's start with a concept from psychology called window of tolerance, developed by psychiatrist Dan Siegel. The idea is that every person has a range of emotional intensity they can stay present for without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. Inside that window, a person can hear difficult feelings, sit with conflict, tolerate someone else's sadness or fear or need, and respond thoughtfully. Outside that window, on either end, a person either becomes flooded and reactive, or numb and withdrawn. Crucially, this window is not the same size for everyone, and it's shaped heavily by a person's own history, especially how much emotional intensity they were exposed to and taught to handle growing up. Here's the part that matters most for what we're discussing today. When someone with a narrow window of tolerance encounters a partner expressing a completely ordinary, completely reasonable emotional need, wanting reassurance after a hard day, wanting to talk through a disagreement instead of letting it sit unresolved, wanting more consistency in communication, that need can genuinely feel overwhelming to them. Not because the need is excessive, because it exceeds what they currently have the internal capacity to hold. And here is where the mislabeling happens almost every time. Instead of the narrow window being named as the limitation, which it is, it becomes far easier, less painful, less implicating, to redirect the problem outward. Not, "I don't have the capacity to meet this right now." Instead, "you're too much." The sentence gets handed to the person with a need, and remarkably often, that person accepts it, absorbs it, and spends years afterward trying to shrink themselves down to a size that might finally fit inside someone else's limited window. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains something that confuses a lot of people about their own history. If you've been told you're too much by more than one person, it's tempting to conclude that the common denominator must be you, and in a sense it is, you are the person these various relationships had in common. But the conclusion most people draw from that they are inherently excessive, doesn't actually follow. A far more accurate conclusion is that you have consistently found yourself in front of people whose emotional windows were narrower than your needs, and every one of them, independently reached for the same explanation because it's a far more comfortable explanation than admitting a limitation. There's a related psychological mechanism worth naming here, something researchers call projection. When a person feels overwhelmed by an emotion they don't have the capacity to process, whether that's guilt, inadequacy, fear of their own limitations, it's psychologically easier to locate that discomfort in someone else than to sit with it internally. A partner who can't meet your emotional needs and who feels a private, uncomfortable sense of inadequacy about that fact will often find it far more tolerable to experience you as demanding than to experience themselves as limited. The discomfort has to go somewhere, and blame is one of the most efficient vehicles available for moving it out of yourself and onto someone else. Wanting to be reassured occasionally is not too much. Wanting a partner to notice when something is wrong is not too much. Wanting consistency, effort, and emotional presence is not too much. These are, by nearly all measure researchers use to define healthy relational needs, entirely ordinary. What varies enormously is not how reasonable the need is, but how much capacity the person receiving it happens to have. Let's bring in a related idea from attachment research, because it helps explain why this particular mislabeling lands so hard on certain people rather than others. Someone who grew up in an environment where their emotional needs were met inconsistently, sometimes attended to, sometimes dismissed, sometimes met with irritation, tends to develop a very specific vulnerability later in life, an assumption that their needs are the variable to be managed, rather than a legitimate part of the relationship to be met. This isn't something anyone consciously decides. It gets built early, often before language, through thousands of small moments of learning whether reaching out for comfort was welcomed or whether it added friction. Someone with this history doesn't just hear, "You're too much," as an isolated criticism. They hear it as confirmation of something they already quietly suspected. This is exactly why the phrase does so much damage, and exactly why it sticks around for years after the relationship that produced it has ended. It isn't landing on neutral ground. It's landing on an old, tender place that was already primed to believe it. Consider a composite example. Someone we'll call Elena. Elena spent 3 years with a partner who, whenever she brought up something bothering her, would go quiet, sometimes for days, before eventually saying something like, "I just don't know how to deal with how much you feel things." Over time, Elena started editing herself before conversations even happened, rehearsing how to bring things up in the smallest, least burdensome way possible, apologizing before she'd even finished a sentence, thanking her partner for listening as though listening were a favor rather than a basic component of a relationship. By the end, Elena had shrunk her emotional expression down to almost nothing, and she still felt, most days, like she was somehow asking for too much. What actually happened, when looked at from the outside, was considerably simpler than the story Elena had internalized. Her partner had a narrow window of tolerance, likely shaped by his own upbringing in a household where emotions were treated as inconvenient. And every time Elena expressed a normal feeling, it exceeded what he had the internal resources to meet. Rather than naming that limitation, which would have required a kind of vulnerability he wasn't equipped for, he handed the discomfort to Elena in the form of a character judgment. And Elena, whose own history had already primed her to interpret her needs as the problem, accepted the verdict without much resistance, because it matched a story she'd been quietly told, in different words, for most of her life. It's worth adding a second example, because this pattern doesn't only show up in romantic partners, and recognizing that widens the picture considerably. Consider someone we'll call Marcus, who grew up as the emotionally attuned child in a family where his mother struggled with her own unprocessed anxiety. From a young age, Marcus learned to read the emotional temperature of a room before anyone else noticed it had changed, softening conflicts, managing his mother's moods, becoming, in effect, the emotional regulator for people who were supposed to be regulating him. As an adult, Marcus found himself repeatedly labeled too intense by friends and colleagues whenever he tried to address something honestly, a conflict at work, a strain in a friendship, a pattern he'd noticed that needed naming. He began to believe there was something fundamentally excessive about his need for honesty and depth in relationships. What was actually happening, looked at clearly, was that Marcus had simply developed an unusually high tolerance for emotional directness, shaped by a childhood that demanded it of him far too early. And he kept finding himself in relationships with people whose windows of tolerance were considerably narrower than his own. His directness wasn't excessive. It was simply out of step with people who hadn't developed the same capacity, and rather than naming that mismatch, they handed him the label instead because it was simpler than admitting they weren't equipped to meet him where he already was. Both of these examples point to the same underlying mechanism, dressed in different circumstances. A gap exists between what one person needs or offers and what another person can currently meet, and rather than naming that gap honestly as a difference in capacity, it gets relocated, quietly, and almost always without malicious intent, onto the person with the larger need or the greater capacity. But guilt requires a kind of accountability many people find deeply uncomfortable to sit with. Shame, by contrast, can be exported. It can be handed to someone else in the form of a judgment. You're too much, and once it lands there, the original person no longer has to feel it themselves. This is, in a sense, an emotional sleight of hand, moving discomfort from the person who generated it to the person who absorbed it, and it happens so quickly and so quietly that neither party usually notices the transfer taking place. Some researchers and clinicians describe this dynamic as capacity mismatch being misread as personal excess. It shows up constantly, and rarely in dramatic form. It shows up as a partner rolling their eyes at a request for reassurance instead of simply providing it. It shows up as a friend who goes silent whenever you bring up something difficult, leaving you to apologize for bringing it up at all. It shows up as a parent, even in adulthood, who responds to a phone call about a hard week with a quick change of subject, teaching, once again, that your internal experience is a burden rather than something worth attending to. It's worth being precise here, because this reframe can be misused if it's taken too far in the other direction. Not every relationship difficulty is a capacity mismatch, and not everyone who says, "I need space," or "that felt like a lot for me right now," is projecting a limitation onto you unfairly. Sometimes timing genuinely is off. Sometimes a need really has been expressed in a way that makes it harder to hear, sharply, in the middle of an unrelated argument, at 2 a.m, in a way that doesn't leave room for the other person to actually respond well. Emotional maturity involves being able to tell the difference between a partner naming an honest limit around timing or delivery, and a partner using the language of overwhelm to avoid a legitimate need altogether. The first is a reasonable boundary. The second is a pattern worth naming for what it is. One useful marker for telling these apart is whether the difficulty is about intensity or about substance. Someone with a genuinely narrow window of tolerance who is otherwise a caring, self-aware partner might say something like, "I really want to talk about this, but I need 20 minutes to calm down first," or "Can we revisit this tomorrow, when I can actually be present for it?" That's a person naming their limit while still honoring the legitimacy of your need. Compare that to a partner who responds to nearly any expressed need, regardless of tone or timing, with some version of "you always need something," or "here we go again," or a heavy sigh followed by silence. That second pattern isn't a boundary around intensity. It's a chronic unwillingness to meet the need at all, repackaged as a complaint about how it's being asked for. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with finally seeing this clearly, and it's worth naming directly rather than rushing past it. If you've spent years believing you were too much, recognizing instead that you are simply too much for someone with limited capacity can bring genuine relief, but it can also bring a specific kind of sadness, mourning the version of yourself that spent so long trying to become smaller for people who were never going to meet you fully no matter how much you shrank. That grief is not a step backward. It's an honest acknowledgement of what the old belief actually cost, and it usually needs to be felt rather than skipped past on the way to feeling better. It's also worth saying plainly that this reframe is not a license to excuse every relationship failure by deciding, unilaterally, that the other person simply couldn't handle you. Genuine self-reflection still matters. Real patterns of communication still matter. The goal here isn't to stop examining your own behavior. It's to stop assuming, automatically and without evidence, that your needs themselves are the defect, when very often the more accurate explanation was sitting on the other side of the relationship the entire time. So how does this actually change anything going forward? The first shift is learning to notice the specific moment when a need gets reframed as a character flaw and pausing before absorbing it. When a partner responds to a reasonable request with some version of "you're too much," there's a brief window where you can ask, silently, is this actually about the size of what I'm asking or about the size of what they're currently able to give? That distinction alone, practiced consistently, starts to interrupt a pattern that many people have been running on autopilot for years. The second shift involves paying closer attention to how a person responds to your needs over time, rather than in any single moment. One uncomfortable conversation doesn't prove someone has a narrow window of tolerance. A consistent pattern across months and years, where ordinary needs are repeatedly met with irritation, withdrawal, or blame. A fourth shift involves examining the specific language you use internally when a need arises, because the old belief tends to hide inside vocabulary long after the original relationships that produced it are gone. Notice whether you find yourself pre-apologizing before expressing a need. "Sorry, this is probably too much," or minimizing needs before they've even been stated. "It's not a big deal. I just thought I'd mention it." This kind of language often persists as a kind of residue, a habit built to preempt a rejection that, in a given relationship, may no longer actually be coming. Slowly removing the apology from the front of a sentence and simply stating the need plainly is a small but surprisingly significant act of unlearning. A fifth shift, worth naming honestly, is recognizing that not every relationship is salvageable simply by naming this pattern out loud. Sometimes a partner, once shown the distinction between their limited capacity and your reasonable need, is willing to grow, to stretch their own window of tolerance, to take ownership of the gap rather than continuing to hand it back to you. That growth is possible, and it does happen. But sometimes a partner, when shown this same distinction, simply doubles down on the original framing, insisting the problem really was your excessiveness all along, because acknowledging otherwise would require a kind of accountability they're not willing to hold. Recognizing which of these two responses you're actually getting, rather than hoping indefinitely for the first while receiving the second, is one of the more painful but necessary pieces of clarity this whole reframe eventually demands. Here's the insight worth carrying out of this. You were never actually too much.